Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, listeners across the plain. My name is Chris.
And I'm Danielle, and this is the State of Freedom. Welcome, everybody. We're so thrilled that you would be spending part of your day with us. Today, we have a special guest in our first episode in the Candidate Spotlight series. But before we introduce you to Liz, let me start out with our scripture. Today, I'm going to be reading Psalm 149. It's verses 1 through 9, pretty short psalm. And it says, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord. It's time to sing to God a brand new song so that all his holy people will hear how wonderful he is. May Israel be enthused with joy because of him, and may the sons of Zion pour out their joyful praises to their king. Break forth with dancing, make music, and sing God's praises with the rhythm of drums. Break forth with dancing, for he enjoys his faithful lovers. He adorns the humble with his beauty, and he loves to give them victory. His godly lovers triumph in the glory of God, and their joyful praises will rise even while others sleep. God's high and holy praises fill their mouths, for their shouted praises are their weapons of war. These warring weapons will bring vengeance on the nations and every resistant power, to bind kings with chains and rulers with iron shackles. Praise-filled warriors will enforce the judgment decreed against their enemies. This is the honor he gives to all his godly lovers. Hallelujah, praise the Lord." And as I was praying this morning, the Lord began to talk to me about the fact that we are embarking on a victory campaign. And I was like, Lord, what does that mean? And he was saying that the victory is already written in history. It's not certain in the future tense. It's almost like past tense. It's so certain. So when I read this psalm, I was blown away because it, to me, is just a picture of a victory campaign. How amazing is it? It literally gives us the key to victory, which is unrestrained praise. Praising and celebrating the Lord brings God's vengeance on the enemies of his people, and it enforces judgment on them. How amazing is that, Chris?
That's incredible. And, our guest today, no question, is a praise-filled warrior because she's a person of faith. She works very hard, and she's demonstrated through her actions and her courage that she stands with the citizens of Louisiana. Talk can be very, very cheap, but she is a doer of great deeds, and it is such a pleasure to have Solicitor General Liz Murrill on our show today. How are you this morning, Liz?
I'm great. And Danielle, thank you for that moving, I think, selection. There's another message in there that I think is important, and it's a message of humility. And not everybody, when you run for office, we're not always surrounded by that, but that certainly is something that I pray for every day and that moves me. I think that it is so important to be, filled with hope and faith and joy and praise, and also be humble.
Amazing. And I couldn't agree more. And I think keeping in mind who God is always kind of keeps us in our place. So you're 100% correct. So Liz, I'll just start out because we have a lot that we'd love to get into this episode. Maybe we can just start out with you telling us a little bit about the role of the Solicitor General. How was the office set up? I personally don't know that much about the role of the Solicitor General, so maybe just a 101 for us.
Well, it does vary a little bit from state to state. Attorney General Jeff Landry started this office when he took office in 2016. He created the Solicitor General role in our office. It is predominantly a job that supervises the state's appearance in federal courts from top to bottom and protects our sovereign interests from the intrusion of the federal government. So I'm kind of a guardian of the state against the federal government to make sure that we continue to have a role as a separate independent state and one of the 50 who can have different state solutions for different problems that we face, and then I'll represent us in federal courts all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow, that's so impressive. And if there was ever a time in history when we need just such a guardian, of state sovereignty it is now. So I didn't even realize before you said it that the office of the Solicitor General is so recent, 2016. But we certainly need it, Liz. And speaking of being a sort of a protective barrier for our state sovereignty against federal tyranny, I know that your office has been involved very directly in the federal lawsuit that has exposed on a massive scale this systematic collusion between the federal government and big tech media conglomerates to suppress First Amendment speech. If there's one issue that our listeners are deeply concerned by, it is the governmental policing of our First Amendment speech. Talk to us a little bit about your involvement in this most important lawsuit and where it is now and where you see it going from here.
Well, Chris, we've talked many times about my own experience with my son during COVID and our state's experience with lockdowns and pushback against our governor. All of that kind of informed our approach to this case when we had seen evidence of censorship of our ability to speak about even our own personal experiences on these tech platforms. And so the more we investigated that, the more we were able to identify pressure and coercion that was being brought to bear on these tech companies. So the collusion is preceded by coercion. And I think that's very, very important in our case, because what the government can't do is coerce these companies and force them through threats or inducements to censor people's speech. It basically turns them into agents of the government, where they are asking private companies to do something the government cannot do itself and that the government knows it can't do, but it's going to try and do it anyway by coercing the company.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Liz, that you bring that point up because if you read through some of the actual communications that were brought out in discovery, communications between the federal authorities and the big social media giants, it's obvious as you read through those communications that the federal government is fully aware of what its constraints are and is rather sneakily trying to get around those constraints. They're trying to achieve the objective that they want without making it glaringly obvious, but they end up making it pretty obvious what they're trying to do. So you're exactly right. The coercion is what the key is here. The coercion precedes the collusion. But it's staggering to me the level of interaction and the level of communication between the federal government and these big tech media. So procedurally right now, where is that case?
It is on appeal in the Fifth Circuit. We have oral arguments scheduled next Friday, a week from this Friday, in New Orleans at the United States Fifth Circuit. And the government has challenged the order that Judge Doty issued enjoining them from colluding and censoring people's speech. And so we will see. I think that it's a big deal. It really is a big deal. The whole enterprise is a big deal. The kind of evidence that we uncovered is extremely concerning. And, I just think that we've got to all recognize that this is a threat to the republic. It is not just any other lawsuit. It's not just any other government action. This was a very, very pervasive enterprise that covered multiple departments and had gone well beyond any just censorship of COVID speech, which was bad enough. But it went through elections and it started to cover much more broader things, like even a meme of the first lady that the White House didn't like.
Yes, this is a 154 page or something like that ruling, and I know this may be a tough question, but maybe not for you. Just in a nutshell, what did the federal court find with regard to our federal government being involved in the violation of the First Amendment? What was the actual ruling?
85 pages of that 150 plus page ruling were findings of fact regarding the 20,000 pages of documents that we produced in the case. And so he made a lot of specific findings that the government was engaged in what he referred to as an Orwellian enterprise to censor people's speech.
Wow. Wow.
Unbelievable. And I'm not a legal mind, but I did follow the Twitter files, and I saw that a lot of that evidence has been put forward in the hearings in the House. Did the Twitter files play any role in your case? Were you able to include any of that?
Yeah, a lot of that evidence is there. I mean, I think those things were kind of running on somewhat of a parallel track. I mean, we were operating under the order of the judge that granted early fact finding, early discovery in the case. And so we had actually the power of the federal courts enforcing our requests for information. Twitter was voluntarily producing those that information after Elon Musk took over Twitter. So that was absolutely an important change for us in the case because Twitter became much more cooperative. These companies, they can't do this voluntarily or they would lose their Section 230 immunity and they would become editors like a newspaper editor and they would be subjected to different rules under federal law. So that's why you see them being very quiet. I mean, the federal government is out there saying that they were doing it voluntarily, but you haven't seen any of them stepping up and saying, yes, we were doing this voluntarily, and that's why.
That's exactly right, because then they go from being a mere platform to sort of admitting that they are, in fact, publishers, which
Right.
goes directly to their 230 immunity. That's a
Exactly.
great point, Liz.
And can I also ask, so if you win on behalf of the state,
How about this, Danielle? How about when she wins?
when she wins, thank you, Chris. When you win, what will that mean in practical terms for consumers and for the government?
Well, we would certainly continue our fight on the federalism side of things. That's obviously a big priority. I think, for me and I think for the state, we've got to look at what the needs are of our state right now. Crime is at the top of the list of concerns of our people. We know that. I am committed to working with the DAs and the sheriffs to figure out what solutions we need to bring to the table from the Attorney General's office. And I get the question all the time of what can we do in the Attorney General's office? And I think there are a lot of things that we can do. And one of the things is that we can convene an advisory council of DAs and sheriffs to see what kind of centralized support they need from our office. And then we go out and provide it. That's just a number one priority for me. Prosecuting, providing assistance in prosecutions. And then, there's always the concern about DAs that aren't prosecuting. I can tell you that my experience with the DAs is that most of them are all very, very dedicated public servants, and that we've got to target the cities where crime is high and figure out what all the inputs are that we need to address that problem. I believe it's achievable, but it's going to take multiple people involved, I think, in targeting what the problems are.
Yeah, I'll say this, Liz, in response to what you said a few minutes ago about giving them or assisting them with resources and manpower to prosecute these cases when you're needed. One of the common themes that I've seen in district attorney's office, also in law enforcement for that matter, but specifically within DA's offices throughout the state, particularly the bigger ones, is that they're often overwhelmed. They often have more on their plate than they can handle effectively. And so having the Attorney General there as a resource to assist them in moving forward and prosecuting some of these cases, I think that would be absolutely invaluable to them. And putting together a task force that you're talking about with DAs and throughout the state, your office, I can't think of anything that would be more helpful moving forward on that front. So I'm so glad to hear that that's one of your ideas.
It's, 100%. Crime is 100% a problem for the whole state. If it's happening, if crime is spiking in Shreveport or it's spiking in New Orleans, that's a problem for the whole state. It's not just a local problem. And I think we have to approach it that way. I go to New Orleans, I have employees in New Orleans. We all have family and people who go to New Orleans regularly. Some of our kids go to school there. I mean, New Orleans and Shreveport, where crime is high, Baton Rouge, where crime is high, We've just got to target the problem and figure out what resources are needed and then address it. I'm a result oriented person. I'm going to come in and tackle the problem, and then we're going to go find the resources that we need. I think we don't look at it from a defeatist standpoint of, well, we don't have resources, so we can't address the problem. No, we figure out what we need to do, address the problem, and then we go do that.
Fantastic. And a question for you, maybe just zooming out a little bit. What, broadly speaking, can you tell us a little bit about what the role of the Attorney General's office is? You've told us about the way that it ties into crime and the role that it may play there, but just broadly speaking for the state.
A lot of different ways that we address crime and abuse. I mean, we have a whole group of people that address elderly abuse. We have an entire division that is dedicated to consumer protection. So we deal with scams and education as a component of helping people to not become victims. We have an investigations unit that investigates crime with statewide jurisdiction to investigate crimes. So we can provide support and assistance to the chiefs of police around the state. And then we prosecute. We prosecute on recusals from the DAs or on a request for assistance from a DA. So we do all of those things in our office. We have 520 employees, and probably half our office is dedicated to those functions.
Wow. It sounds like, Liz, whereas other attorney generals in history sort of have sat back and waited for specific requests from DA's offices to be able to get involved in criminal prosecutions, it sounds to me like you intend to be much more proactive in terms of your communications with the DAs, in terms of your availability to assist, and really, I guess, in terms of particular requests from your office to get involved in some of these criminal matters.
Well, I absolutely intend to be proactive and to seek out the DAs who need help and to engage them in continuously advising our office on how we can provide help. It's not a static thing. It's a dynamic problem. Not, one DA may need help at one time, and then we address the problem and we need to go help somebody else after that. So I think that's one of the benefits of our office and the central prosecutorial function that we perform, is that where they may not necessarily be able to hire somebody full time, or they may have one or two cases that they need help with. We can provide that assistance, and then we can go provide the assistance to another DA when they need it.
Yeah. One of the things that in listening to you speak, that occurs to me is that, again, other attorney generals in our state, have been elected to the position, some of whom really have never walked into a courtroom and actually tried a case, litigated a case, and really are more or less administrators in the office. That certainly does not describe Liz Murrill, who has the ability to walk into any courtroom, anytime, any place, and make an argument on behalf of Louisiana citizens, which is exactly really what you're doing right now. There is no higher venue. There is no higher playing field than the United States Supreme Court, and there is no issue of more profound significance to the citizens of Louisiana than the fight against federal tyranny, which is what you've been doing on the ground level, which is exactly why, in our view, you are uniquely qualified to be Attorney General. I have to ask you about this, Liz. I want to get back specifically because I think Danielle will tell you this. The big fear that people in our state have, they say, you know what, Chris, it's not just a matter of if, it's a matter of when is the federal government going to manufacture the next emergency in order to justify another suspension of our essential liberty in Louisiana. When is it going to happen? And they are deeply concerned that we are not going to have the backbone, the infrastructure, and the will to resist it. So in that connection, I want to ask you specifically about your view of the COVID lockdowns, the origin of those lockdowns, the effect that had on our state, what your view of that is, your own personal involvement in it, because I know that you had a family member directly affected by the vaccine. Give our listeners some reassurance that you will stand up to that type of tyranny the next time it rears its ugly head in this state.
Chris, I absolutely agree that we've got to be very, very diligent about ensuring that the kinds of violations of the Constitution that occurred during COVID never happen again. And I testified about that in Congress a few weeks ago in an oversight hearing regarding the Constitution and churches. And what was shocking to me was seeing half of the committee, you can predict or guess which half the committee it was, but that were not only defending every constitutional intrusion that occurred, but they were actually accusing us of harming the country by talking about the Constitution being violated and talking about protecting against those violations. It is an existential threat to the First Amendment. It's an existential threat to the Constitution itself and to the Republic. And you can see the movement toward demonizing the Constitution by our speech about these violations. And so there's a lot to be concerned about. I mean, you referred to my personal experience with my son. He developed myocarditis. This is a very publicly known thing. After he was vaccinated to go be a camp counselor when he was 17, his senior year in high school. And he ended up in ICU for a week with myocarditis. And I mean, it was serious, very serious. He could not get out of bed. He could not mow the lawn for 3 months while he was under the direct supervision of a cardiologist. He's still under the supervision of a cardiologist, and he will be, seeing a cardiologist for the rest of his life. So this is not something that is mild or that somebody just recovers from. It causes damage to your heart, and it can expose you to further complications for the rest of your life. And you'll never really, really know how much damage it's done until you are perhaps in your 50s or 60s. And so to see our people in our Department of Health and all the way up through the federal government claiming that this was no big deal, nothing to see here, 1 in a million. Well, now it turns out it's 1 in 3,000 or it's 1 in 650. It is an extraordinarily higher number. And what I was pushing back against was not vaccination itself. It was, let's engage a real fair and honest examination of the data. Let's be careful about what we are doing with our children. It's one thing for me to take the risk. I'm almost 60. It's another thing to say that we're going to do this to 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 17-year-olds. The risk to them is for the rest of their life, and they were largely not at risk to the same degree with COVID. We knew that the vaccine, after the first year, we knew that it wasn't protecting from transmission. And so at that point, this should have been a conversation with your doctor to decide what your personal risk was. And that conversation wasn't happening, in part, we now know from our lawsuit, because the federal government didn't want to allow speech that would inhibit the vaccine uptake. And so they were just determined to make sure that they could get everybody jabbed as much as they could, regardless of what the facts or the consequences said. So they were so invested in their own decision-making and their own message that they could not address the changing facts. They have now taken J&J off the market. And so women were raising questions and doctors were raising questions. People were raising questions. And that discussion was being inhibited by the federal government because they didn't want it to contribute to vaccine hesitancy. So we saw what happened with churches in our own state. We ended up with a very close decision regarding the prosecution of a pastor who had criticized the government. That issue was not about whether you like the pastor or you agreed with his speech. It was about the government subjecting him to 2 years of criminal prosecution for something that was protected speech, and an order that had created new law, criminal law, that was being enforced by local law enforcement when we know that the law doesn't permit the government to do that.
Yes, someone should have reminded some of these authorities that the Alien and Sedition Acts were repealed 199 years ago.
Well, we did.
Hmm.
I know that you absolutely did, and that's why you were successful on that. And I had forgotten that you were directly involved in that, but that was a powerful case. That was a Pastor Spell, right, Liz? What that was his case.
That was Tony Spell's case. And I think that it just sort of really, I think, acutely illustrates what the risk is when you don't have any enforcement of separation of powers, when people are driven by fear to the point that no one will actually enforce the constitutional protections that already exist. Even after the Supreme Court had said that any executive order that treats churches more punitively than it treats Lowe's or Home Depot is subject to strict scrutiny, and it can't withstand that scrutiny, so it's unconstitutional. They continued with the prosecution. And at the Supreme Court hearing, Chris, you might remember this if you listened to the arguments at the time, but a couple of the justices, Justice McCallum and Justice Creighton in particular, were asking some very good questions. And one of them said, why Pastor Spell? He obviously wasn't the 11th or the 51st person in the church. He was probably the first person in the church, which means it wasn't really him that violated the order. It
Right.
good question, right? And the answer was astonishingly frank but concerning. The answer was because he was unrepentant.
What?
Thank you. That is the same reaction I had, Danielle. Because he was unrepentant. What was he unrepentant about?
Do we need to repent to the government now?
What in the world? This is absolutely, Liz, you talk about Orwellian. It is absolutely shocking.
So Justice McCallum and Justice Creighton were asking some very pointed questions about why Tony Spell had been targeted for the citations to begin with, since he was more than likely not the 11th or the 51st person in the church, the orders having at that time restricted you to 50 or 10 people. And so, it was a good question because he wasn't. He was probably the first person in the church. He's the pastor. And what was shocking was the answer. The prosecutor very frankly and shockingly said that the reason was because he was unrepentant.
I can't even believe that. It just shows you that the government thinks it's God, right? I mean, obviously.
Well, yeah, and I mean, what part of it was part of what was shocking was their lack of self knowledge of what they were even saying, because the prosecutor was acknowledging not only that they had targeted him for his speech criticizing the governor about something that was flagrantly unconstitutional, the orders that treated churches differently, but also that they targeted him for that speech, which is retaliation for protected speech under the First Amendment. So they were acknowledging not only that the prosecution was flawed from the outset, but that it was targeting someone for their protected speech.
One of the reactions, Liz, to precisely what you're talking about right now was, I believe it was SB 63, and it was brought this session by Senator Beth Mizell, who's a very conscientious state senator here in Louisiana, and would establish as a matter of constitutional law that not only the fact of religious worship, but the location of religious worship is a matter of a core constitutional right and sensibility. And that is a constitutional amendment that will be going to the people in October. I believe that the Attorney General's office supported that legislation, but to us, it's very, very important. I am personally very impressed with the vigor and the energy with which you seem to be approaching these issues of state sovereignty. And almost everything that we've talked about today touches upon state sovereignty, federalism, and the extent to which we are going to have leaders in this state who are willing to stand up to increasing federal overreach. It sounds to me like you have a very, very good grasp of these issues generally and are clearly in the best position to protect our sovereignty and our rights here in Louisiana.
Yeah, look, I think it's a shame that we had to actually pass a constitutional or propose a constitutional amendment to reinforce the protections that we already have. But you're right. I mean, I'm 100% dedicated to protecting our people and our state. I mean, I feel very, very strongly that our fundamental liberties are at stake, that the republic is under attack, and that we need people who really, really understand what's at stake so they can identify those threats when they come. If you don't have the experience and the wisdom and the knowledge and the willingness to fight these fights, then you really shouldn't be applying for this job.
You're so right. And you know what else comes to mind, Liz, is just that you have to know what your rights are. And I think that is a big part of the reason that we as citizens are in the predicament we find ourselves in with such eroded liberties, is because we have stopped understanding what our rights are and where the limitations of the government's rights are.
Right. And I think we have to continue to educate the public. We need to educate our children. One of the things that we know is that it only takes one generation to lose the republic. We had, people who laid their lives and their economic stability and everything on the line to create the Constitution and to separate themselves from tyranny. And I think that we've got to continue to educate our children about what was at stake, why they fought for it, and why those are values that are still critically important today because they are under attack.
So very well said. So very well said. Liz, we are going to wrap up here, but before we go, I want to first of all thank you for, on behalf of our show, for fighting for the First Amendment. George Washington said that if they destroy the First Amendment like sheep to the slaughter, shall we be led. And your tenacity with which you have fought for our right to maintain a free voice in our state against a government obviously trying to suppress it. I don't have the words to describe to you the level of gratitude that I personally feel to you. And I know that thousands listening to this show right now feel the exact same way. Talk is very, very cheap. Danielle and I have come to understand that only so acutely since we've been involved in advocacy work. Talk is cheap, but you've put your money where your mouth is and you've worked very, very hard. I want to ask the last question. I'm going to throw it to you here and ask you to speak to our listeners. What is it, and you've alluded to these things throughout the course of the show, but in a nutshell, what is it that makes you exceptionally qualified and puts you in a position over and above any of your opponents to be the next Attorney General of the state of Louisiana?
My experience, my passion for the job and the mission, I'm deeply committed to protecting our rights. And I'm a mom of 4 sons. I'm a wife. I've been married for 30 years. I have 9 generations of family dating all the way back to before statehood in our state. So I'm just very, very invested in the success of our state and our people. And that's why I'm running. And I think 30 years of experience defending the state and defending our people speaks a lot to my commitment to this job.
Yeah, absolutely, Liz. And I'll say, I just want to tack on there, not just your experience, but your success. I think that's what needs to be underscored here.
Very true. We're sort of taught as lawyers. I know Liz can tell you this. Actually, Liz, I don't know if you remember this. You probably don't. But back in the fall of 1996, you taught me legal writing at the LSU School of Law, and I actually became a better writer because of the way you taught us all how to structure sentences and issues and make arguments. So you put your money where your mouth is, even at the LSU Law School in the classroom as well. So I wanted to mention that also, and just really, really thankful that you joined us today.
Well, thank you. And of course, I do remember teaching you, Chris. And I think that, I appreciate the work that y'all are doing to continue to engage the public. And that's something that I want to do too. And I think that now more than ever, we know that words matter. I've always, cared about the rule of law, and the rule of law is built on words. So we've seen now the attempt to change the meaning of words like male or female. And it dramatically changes the law and how it applies to us and to our state and to our federal funding, and to, whether a woman has to share a locker room with someone who is a biological male or share scholarships with the biological male. So, we've just never seen any time, I think, more critical than now. And I appreciate y'all and the work that you're doing too.
Well, we're behind you 100% here.
Yes, absolutely.
And God bless you, Liz. The state of freedom is behind you. Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group is behind you, the thousands of listeners, and we are going to be praying for you moving forward. You know, you've got some vigorous days of work ahead of you, but you are going to win because you are the most qualified and you've worked the hardest and you've demonstrated your complete and total loyalty to the citizens of Louisiana. So God bless you moving forward. We hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz.
Take care.
Chris, I really enjoyed talking to her. She's so fascinating, and I just really, really appreciate her passion and her knowledge of the law. And I mean, you can just tell that she's a fighter.
Oh, it comes across in her voice. It comes across in her voice that, she's not backing down. She understands the issues. She understands the battles that we're in. She's been directly affected, as she talked about, by this federal overreach regarding these vaccines. Her own family has been affected. Nothing motivates a person more than when they themselves or a member of their family is adversely affected by government abuse of power. So I think I'm just so happy we had her on. We will have to have her back on soon.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to her after she argues the rest of that case or the appeal at the end of next week. It'd be cool to hear from her, even if it's just a short interview with her, to hear the outcome and how things go in court.
We will absolutely have to do that. And until then, I will encourage all of our listeners to continue to share the State of Freedom podcast, continue to follow Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, lacag.org. By the way, Danielle, what is the website for the State of Freedom?
It is freedomstate.us.
Yes, freedomstate.us. Go to our website, check us out. You're going to enjoy it and support us. And if you do that and you continue, Danielle, there's no stopping us at this point. That's what makes it so exciting.
It is so exciting. And I just want to make sure that we say it very clearly that we are in enthusiastic and unrestrained support of Liz Murrill and her candidacy for Attorney General. I think that we made that point pretty clear, but just in case anyone thought we, weren't clear on that point, we want to say it loudly and strongly. She's our woman.
She is our woman, the woman of the hour, and when she wins, we will know that we have taken another grand step to preserve the state of freedom in Louisiana.
We will. Thanks, Chris.
God bless you.
God bless you. Thanks for listening to The State of Freedom. To stay on top of all the calls to action we mentioned today, just check out the show notes for the episode. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org, lacag.org, or email Chris at chris@lacag.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share it. Give us a good rating in the reviews. If you own a business in Louisiana and are interested in supporting our show through advertising, please email us at ads.freedomstate@gmail.com. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.